Today's talk is on Alaskan explorers. And you may ask yourself, why is she talking about history now? There's a reason. You will understand it as we come closer towards the end of it. In the very beginning, there's a lot of dates in history, so don't get bored too much. I try to stay away from dates, but just give yourself I try to keep it down to just years, so that you get an idea. Oh well, this was in the early 1700s or the early 1800s, and it's just once we get through that movement of that, then you'll see how everything kind of ties in and why this is the most amazing place. Not just because of what you've experienced, or those of you that have come before, and you keep coming back. It is the most repeated cruise of all cruises that exist. My audio on. Here we go. Testing. There we go. I'm used to the big lounge, and the other day I started one of my talks, and I had the mic, and I'm talking, but there was a lady in the back that couldn't hear, and I realized, oh, I need the microphone. Here we go. So, everybody hear me okay? If you didn't know by now, my name is Linda Scott. Spasiba. Is your husband okay? He's doing okay? Oh, good. Find a seat that you're comfortable. You do the chairs in the front are for something later on with a special group. And since it's a wonderful group of you, I want you to make sure that you can see the screen and I'm not in your way with the screen. Can you see okay over there? Of course, you have the support of the TVs on either side should you just decide to turn around and look there. Okay. Today we're going to talk about the folks that were the trailblazers, and there were a lot of them, but there's some whose names stand out forevermore, and we are so grateful to what they did and what they believed. Of course, we know the first people that came were what we call the first people. It was the Siberian Passageway. It was it lasted from 16,000 to 10,000 BC, the Bering Land Bridge. Now, all native people crossed that land. Some liked Alaska and stayed, but the most of them went south and became Navajo, the Mexican Indians, the Incas, the Aztecs, and so on. This is where they initially came from. Interestingly enough, the Indians that we call Eskimos, the Inuits, did not come then. They came and chose to stay in that northern tundra, and they came by boats. We don't know why, but they did, and they chose to stay in that area. So that gives you the idea of the coastline from those years. And then, of course, it dissipated and became smaller and smaller until it separated from Siberia to Alaska. Now, it's important to remember that during the years of discovery, which after Columbus, and then it was a huge expansion through those centuries, the people in Europe were still looking for what they called the Northwest Passage. In other words, if I wanted to go from Europe to Asia, I didn't want to go around Africa to Asia, and I didn't want to go around the tip of South America to whatever was on the side. I wanted a Northwest Passage that would take me northwest and down. So that was one of the big things that pushed them. And they had that problem, of course, with the South America going around the tip. Even the folks that were in the 1848, the gold rush in California, they had to either cross as frontiersmen and women, or they had to go around the tip of South America. There was no other way to get to California. The full railroads had not been built yet. Well, this is it's an ironic story. It's funny how there's no accidents in life. The first written accounts of Europeans coming to this area was in 1648 when a seaman named Demon Desnev sailed from the mouth in Russia of the Kolyma River through the Arctic Ocean, and he ran and around the eastern tip of what he thought was Asia. But what he did, he actually wound up in what was the area that we now call Alaska. One legend says that he was really went off course and that's why he wound up on the shores of Alaska. Well, of course, this was uncharted territory, and the journey that was between Siberia was not connected to North America anymore, but he had unknowingly, essentially, discovered this area. Well, he was semi-literate and not thought well of, but he was a boater, a man. He did a fishing and things like that, and so. But what he claimed he saw went on for 75 years. That story, they didn't know if it was true or it was something a fisherman's tale that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it went on for 75 years about this discovery that he claimed he'd made. So in 1725, the Tsar of Russia called for an expedition to answer the question once and for all: was Siberia truly connected to this area that we call North America? You got to remember, too, we know that there were so many European countries all over the world discovering new lands, what we call the New World. The Tsar, with Russia, had not been very active, and he felt this was going to be their last opportunity to plant any kind of colonial foot. So the first voyage was in 1728. This is the early 1700s now. It was led by a man named Vitus Bering. He rounded the East Cape and headed to the Kamchatka Peninsula, right up there. While on that peninsula, he noticed definite signs that there really was land to the east. He tried to send some ships, but the weather there can get really bad, and he couldn't get through. So he decided to give up, and he returned to St. Petersburg in 1730. The second Kamchatka expedition, which they called the Great Northern Expedition, was also led by Vitus Bering. Now look at that map. That's the map that they had back then. You can see that up until the early 1700s, they really had that. We're talking a couple of centuries there. There were a lot of explorers that had really increased and made more perfect the maps of the world that they had at the time. So you can see everywhere, even on the United States eastern coast, and over in Russia, of course. Beautiful maps, but what is that blob? It's a blob. They weren't sure what it was. They had no idea, and that's how they drew what they thought might be this piece of land, which, of course, is northern Canada, the Yukon, and Alaska. It's wild. But that is an old copy. That's a copy of an old map of what they thought, well, maybe that's what it looks like. So this northern expedition was very important to Russia. It was the largest expedition in history, really. It involved 3,000 people, directly or indirectly, and the total cost was 1.5 million rubles. That's back then. You can imagine what it might have cost them then. That was an enormous amount of money for Russia, and it was completely financed by the Russian state. And we put it into perspective today, that amount of rubles would have been about 1/6 of the Russian economy. And remember, whatever country you lived in the early 1700s, unless you were the aristocracy, you suffered a lot. So that was a lot of money. So for this expedition, they had 2 ships. One was led by Vitus Bering, called the St. Peter, the other by Alexei Chirikov on the St. Paul. In 1741, now we're still in the close to the mid-range of the 1700s, both of them set sail from the southeastern corner of the Kamchatka Peninsula, and 6 days later, they lost each other in fog. But both vessels continued to go east. Chirikov was the first to sight land, which was now we think is mostly probably the west side of the Prince of Wales Island. He sent a group in a longboat over to the land, making them the first Europeans documented in Alaska. However, they never returned. So, Chirikov sent another group. They vanished. Well, having no more boats to send, Chirikov finally lifted his anchor and returned back to Russia. Then it was Bering's turn to try his luck in what this area is that he had no idea, had no name, but they were going to find out. His first sighting was near a towering peak on the Alaska mainland now that it was near Hubbard Glacier. It was at this time that Russia made their first recorded attempts at contact with the native Aleuts. And there's the mountain that he saw. These are drawings by the men of the crew, and they really admired these canoes. They'd never seen anything like it. The way they were built, how seaworthy they were. They were amazed. Well, to say the least, Bering had been gone for 8 years. He was ready to go home. Okay, now we found it. We know there's something there. There's some native people there. We're going back to St. Petersburg. So he was on his way back. But he didn't make it. The ship ran aground on an island. And let me show you what this island looks like if I've got it here. He had scurvy. I'll go back one. I guess the island's not there. He died of scurvy. Who knows what else he died of, but he died and he was buried there. The ship wrecked there, and the men that survived the winter, there were about 46 of them that survived. They actually built a boat and were able to get back to the far eastern coast of Russia. That was after the weather had improved, and that was in the summer of 1742. So, while Bering would not make it back on the final leg, his name, his legacy is everywhere. He kept detailed journals. You'll discover that a lot of these explorers had amazing journals, if you're ever interested in finding out about any of the things that they wrote. His journal and the results of this exploration would make it back to Russia. And that was because of the help of the onboard surgeon and naturalist. Come, please come. Your wife is right here, sir. She's right down there. See, I know you guys. Spasiba. I haven't seen him. I think he's in the casino. Come on down. Be comfortable. Find a seat that you're comfortable with. Okay, so Bering didn't make it, but the onboard surgeon and naturalist did. He took all the paperwork back to Russia, and this man's name, as you see there, it's a photograph or a painting of him. His name was Georg Wilhelm Steller. You may recognize that name. He ensured that Bering's charts and notes were published, as you see here. In his book, he described the many landmarks that now they use facetiously bear his name, like Bering. There's the Bering Island, where he passed. There's the Bering Sea, and the rocky island, of course, Bering Island. Shortly after that, the time they spent in Alaska, Steller himself became the first naturalist to describe a number of North American plants and animals, and many bear his name, such as the beautiful Steller jay that he saw here, and many others. Now, Steller was a naturalist, so today's world, naturalists, scientists, they kind of get, and even doctors get more into there's specialists. There's general and specialists. He was a general naturalist, but he also had specific things he was interested in or amazed him. And one of those things was snails. And he was one of the first people to actually document this unique life form. From the pages of his publication, which was called Beasts of the Sea, we see animals that we recognize and some that we don't. He made it possible for us to understand the beginnings of what the world of snails is, that goes all the way from Alaska on the Pacific coast, Alaska to California, and if you do the scientific name of any snail, the name attached to it in the scientific world is called Beringius, Beringius. So he made a description he drew in his book, Beasts of the Sea. You take a look at that page, and of course this is from the Alaska State Library. We recognize on the left-hand side, those are probably stellar sea lions, some sort of sea lion. But what is that animal on the right-hand side? Well, Stella wrote this. These animals live in herds at sea. During the eating, they move their heads up and down, their neck like an ox. They lift their head out of the water and draw fresh air with a rasping and snorting sound like a horse. Steller called it a sea cow. It came to be known as the Steller sea cow. This was a huge manatee. Now, we know that there are manatees that live in waters of Florida and some other places too, but this was a mammoth animal. It did at one time live in Alaska waters. It could survive in the cold water. It was the size of a small whale, and they were vegetarians. Very docile creatures. Even today, the ones that are much, much smaller are docile and vegetarians. And unfortunately for them, they were very tasty. So, slow like a cow, they were easily hunted, and by 1768, now we're looking towards the end of the 1700s, it's only 27 years after they'd been discovered by Europeans, the last of these Pacific manatees, these Steller sea cows, the last of their kind was harvested, and they were no longer exist on this earth. They are extinct. The history of the Steller sea cow has become one of the shortest periods that a large mammal, and remember, it's the size of a whale, small whale, the last mammal known to not exist anymore in science. But Steller's legacy does live on. With the Steller sea lions. I'm sure you saw some of those. I hope you did. They're huge, so there's a big difference between them and the harbor seals. Now, they serve as an appropriate symbol of this first naturalist in this region. The published journals that I mentioned of Bering and Steller made possible the subsequent exploration of Alaska, but truly, in the turn of the history of this land we call Alaska, it was the crew that brought this to the forefront. And why? Sea otters. And in particular, sea otter pelts. Now, when you were here, when the Rangers were here on Tuesday, did you get a chance to go by their table and look at the sea otter pelt they had? If you touched it, it was so soft and beautiful. They had the finger rule. If you put your finger down on a sea otter pelt, there's approximately 1 million hairs underneath. This animal has no fat, has no blubber to keep itself warm. It is the specific fur. That's why they spend 3/4 of their day cleaning their fur. And if you remember the Valdez Exxon oil situation that happened in 1989, they were able to clean and help most of the birds, some of the other animals. But every single sea otter that was in that Gulf area died because the oil was all over their pelt and they could not keep warm, and that was the end of them up there. So they're on a list of animals to watch. They're not allowed to be hunted for anymore, but the Russians did a good job on taking care of that. Fortunately, we were able to save it. They started the Russian-American fur trading, and this was big business for Russia because those fur traders wanted those furs. They are fabulous furs. Well, they were in Kodiak and in some other areas near Anchorage, and that was their first headquarters, and they killed all the otters in that area. Then they wound up coming down to Sitka. That was the last place. And they were essentially on the verge of killing them all. It became for Russia just too expensive to run this operation. And Russia was having their time of troubles too, financially and otherwise. And so they decided they were going to sell this piece of land. Well, it makes sense that they would have possibly sold it to Great Britain. Because, Great Britain had all the land, Canada. But there was a little thing called the Crimean War. And so they weren't real happy with Great Britain, and so they went to the United States in 1859, between 59 and 60, and said, "Oh, would you like to buy this massive land up here?" At the time, they were interested, but unfortunately, in our world of history in the United States, Lincoln had just been elected, and South Carolina had seceded from the Union. So we had a situation that we now call the Civil War, or the War between the states. When it was finished, the Tsar approached the United States again and said, "Don't you want to buy this piece of land?" And at that point, Secretary Seward said, "Yes, we will." They paid $7.2 million for that. And I'll get more into that in just a minute. So the map started to become more of what we know today. Now, before I get into the actual United States taking over, you need to know this. The Spanish had some claims, too. In fact, their claim was way back from the 1400s, and they had sent explorers out. And King Charles of Spain was very excited about that. But guess what? They could not maintain anything out here. It was so far and so remote. We know that when we look at a globe, that they just couldn't maintain it. But the Spanish actually gave what they had to the United States. They didn't even sell it. They just gave it to them. They transferred the claims. But the legacy of that Spain was here back in the 1400s, because remember, Spain was given the land at one time that's part of California. That's why if you've been to California or you live there, all the missions, the Camino Real, the Royal Road that goes up from Mexico, that's all from Spain. So, but they just couldn't handle the stuff in Alaska. There was no reason for them to have the money to spend, and what were they going to upkeep? So they gave the land to the United States. But the legacy still lives on with towns like, and names like Valdez. Here is the town of Valdez. And the Maraspina Glacier. So Spain has still got a little bit of it there, but that's Spanish names. Now, here come the British. The big guy, the famous one, Captain James Cook. He sailed every high sea. And it's because of his legacy that we're able to go on a lot of cruises all over the world. There's an example of some of the routes he took. Amazing. His final voyage was in 1778. He tried to get up through the Bering Strait, but it was the bad time of the year where it ices over. He tried and tried and tried, and he couldn't get through. This is what happened previously. The ship had arrived on the west coast of the big island we call Hawaii, near south of the town we now call Kona. The native Hawaiians there were celebrating the time of a specific god. Here comes Cook and his men in this big boat. They thought he was the god. So there was a big celebration. They were really happy. Here's the god walking in. Oh, he's alive. And then Cook said, "Let's go north. I want to see what's up there. And let's go try this, the Bering Strait area." Couldn't get through, so he came back to Hawaii. Guess what? It was the time was over to celebrate this god, and it really confused the natives. And in the confusion, Captain Cook was killed. There is a monument to him south of Kona. No one really knows what they did with his body. Some say maybe he was cannibalized. Some say they don't know. We will never know. But we know that there is a monument south of Kona where this happened and where the ship had come aboard. He was basically the only famous one of all of them that his life was changed. All the other men were able to get back on the ship and get back to Great Britain, and they were noted for not only for what they had accomplished with Captain Cook, but they were all considered heroes, and the English were so happy with all of the studies that had been done. Now, one man in particular was an officer on board that ship with Cook. He was given a hero's welcome. All of them were, but this man in particular. His name was William Bligh, and he was given the ship the HMS Bounty. And you may or may not know, that was the subject of one of the biggest mutinies on the high seas, made into movies, etc. Mutiny on the Bounty. So, we're going back to the British. George Vancouver, he is the one that begins the new change. George Vancouver set sail. He was also with Cook, and he was given the ship, the HMS Discovery. And his mission, again, was to find this mysterious western entrance to the Northwest Passage. It didn't exist. It just didn't exist. And once they realized it, they began to understand this vast, vast amount of land that we know now as Alaska. In concluding, and he did conclude that there was no Northwest Passage, he decided he would chart the coastline, and this man was amazing. In minute detail, he filled noticeable gaps on the map. He began that process. And it's because of him that we can cruise in this area now. He created those maps. That's just a small portion of it. There were many, many, many maps in minute detail. And there are places because of him that we have the names that he called, like Tracy Arm. You may have gone there if you'd gone on the Tracy Arm tour. Holcomb Bay, Icy Strait, which is the entrance into Glacier Bay, which if you heard the Rangers say when George Vancouver went by that entrance, and that's basically where the Rangers had gotten on our ship, there was a 250-foot wall of ice. It was a glacier. So he marked it as such, and it remained that way for over 100 years. Of course, all of this is in the Juneau area. Then there's Mount Etchcombe. I don't know if you had a chance to see that. In Sitka, the flat-topped mountain that was once a volcano. And then there's the new Eddystone Rock. Let me see if that's on there. There. If anybody went on the Misty Fjord trip today, they saw the Eddystone Rock because Vancouver went through there. But, Vancouver. The city of Vancouver was named after him. And the island of Vancouver, where we will be going tomorrow, at the southern tip, you will see Victoria. And this area loved George Vancouver. There are statues of him everywhere. He died like a lot of Pacific explorers. He died at the age of 40 in the simple tombstone and burial place that's in England. 40 years old, and think of all that he did. Without him, we wouldn't be here today. And he is everywhere. There are so many statues of him. And the one that I want you to make note of that really is fascinating. When we get to Victoria, and you'll see the legislative building, and you're not going to get as close as this, because obviously this is a telephoto lens, but on the top of the legislative building, you'll see there's a statue of somebody. That's George Vancouver in gold. George Vancouver. So, let's go back to the United States. 1867, the Civil War is over, and the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, says, sure, let's buy that piece of land up there. And there we go with the details in Russian. Maybe you can read it. I don't know. A lot of the old writings are hard to read. They purchased $7.2 million for this huge plot of land. But let me explain to you. Only $2 million was for the land. The rest of it was money that the U.S. owed Russia for military hardware that they'd used during the Civil War. So the land was really only $2 million for all of this. To me, that's just amazing. Believe it or not, that is a photograph of the check. They wrote a check. Can you imagine? Lots of other paperwork, too. Now, if you were in Sitka, well, you were in Sitka, but, I mean, if you noticed or went on a historic tour, even from where we tendered, that space, the highway was above us, you could look up, and there was what they call Castle Hill, or you would have seen a hill, and it's kind of flat, and at the top is like an iron railing that goes around it, and there's a flag there. There once was, this is where the Russians were in Sitka, the final place that they were. There was the Baronoff governor's house there. It had burned down years ago, but it was there in 1869. And that is where the Russian flag went down and the American flag went up. I don't know if we'll ever see that in our lifetime again. Seward making the decision. Did anybody go to Saxman Village today? Did you see this? Did they tell you what it was? Yeah. Okay. They tell everybody else. The elders, which you might call the chief, they don't call them chiefs, of the year. Of course, they were part of this changeover too. Of course, it's important to them who's going to be owning the land that they have to live on. They did what was called a potlatch, a party. And at a potlatch, you bring a gift. So we know today we might bring a casserole or maybe a bottle of wine or whatever to somebody's party. Well, and that was the Indian custom. Seward brought nothing. And it so outraged the chief, the elders, that they created this totem pole of shame. There's nothing else on it but the top. Seward, an effigy of Seward with a red nose and red ears to remind them of the man who did not honor their cultural history and their cultural life. They were not happy at all. It's a good question. Why did that happen? Maybe Seward didn't care. Maybe Seward didn't listen to people. Maybe nobody knew. I don't know. Maybe he was a jerk. I don't know. Oh my God, they gave Seward. I mean, this is what happens at a potlatch. They bring all that they have and they bring to you this as an honored guest. They bring everything. Everybody brings the most important thing they have, and they will bring this to the potlatch. And you will notice the buttons that they have on their blankets. Each button represents a potlatch that they've been to or participated since the day they were born. So Seward did nothing, whether he was advised and he didn't or he didn't know, but he didn't do anything, and that's the end of that. So they built this, and it was moved to Saxman Village. So there we have Seward, and then we have the United States. It's 1869 by the time he got there. It was 1867 they decided to buy it. And we're still in the end of the Civil War where the whole country is split up. If you were from the southern United States, you'd lost everything. If you were from the north, you probably lost someone you loved, a husband, a brother, a father, and industry had gone down. They were trying to rebuild the United States of America. The telegraph wasn't everywhere yet, and they were trying to expand the West. And to put that in perspective too about the loss of lives and it's not that far after the end of the war. There was terrible grief, not about who won or lost, but if you took the number of men, our young men, North and South, that died, and put it in percentage of the men today, the percentage of the population today, it would amount to 7 million men dying in a civil war. 7 million. So there was a lot of grief. And you can imagine that, and you probably know, that this land was called Seward's Icebox, Seward's Folly. They were so angry. Nobody wanted anything to do with what he had done. There was so much anger. We know that now, but if you do research on the old newspapers of the time, it was amazing. Well, the purchase was just the beginning, though. We're going to move forward about 10 years. A man named John Muir, of Scottish immigrants, he was a naturalist. He was fascinated with Yosemite Valley, which, by the way, the fire is going on right now, and they're trying to save the sequoias. I'm like so upset. But anyway, that's something else. John Muir studied Yellowstone, and he saw striations, and he truly believed that this U-shape and striations were because of glaciers that were once there that created Yosemite. But because he wasn't a geologist, the geologists of the day thought he was an idiot. But he did have a couple of friends that were geologists that really believed he was correct, and they supported him. So he decided that he would come up to Alaska. But one thing that he did do that still remains today is he created what we call the Sierra Club. And as you see the mission there, and I want to read this to you because I think it's important. To explore, enjoy, and protect the wild places of the earth, to practice and promote the responsible use of Earth's ecosystems and resources, to educate and enlist humanity, to protect and restore the quality of the natural and human environment, and to use all lawful means to carry out these objectives. Don't you feel that way today? I still feel, and that was written back in the 1800s. His Sierra Club marked the beginning. So here we come to Alaska, the one we know today. It was the beginning of modern-day conservation as we know it. It's surprisingly that during this time, in his time at Yosemite, which I believe I have a photograph here. Yes. Yosemite, that's when he became interested in glaciers. He walked along the cliffs, followed his fingertips along the striations, as you see there, and he was determined to prove that these were created by the passage of the glaciers. So much so that when he heard about glaciers up in Alaska, he headed up here, and in 1879, in October, from Wrangler to the entrance of Glacier Bay, 5 Tlinkits and a priest went with him, a minister went with him, to see if, in fact, there were glaciers they could find. He'd heard the stories of glaciers. Well, all he had was Vancouver's map, which said at the entrance of this area, called Icy Strait, is a 250-foot high ice wall. Guess what? It was gone. It had retreated. So they went in, and that was when the exploration began. We know now he named a lot of the glaciers, and eventually on his 5 to 6 trips that he made to this area, more and more scientists came with him. And this particular glacier, obviously, was named after him. That's what it looked like about a turn of the century. There is a little cabin that he built, and he would write, this is the key, he just didn't keep it to himself. He would write articles that were printed in the San Francisco newspaper and then, of course, distributed to other newspapers all around the United States. Suddenly, people started thinking, well, maybe there's more to Alaska than just a cold ice box. He started this curiosity about this place because he described it in such beautiful detail, both scientifically and for the common man. He wrote this book, Travels in Alaska, that I just told a lady, I don't know if she's still here, she had her Kindle out. You can get this for free on Kindle. It's free. And our native people were selling it this last week, but it's a great read even today. Travels in Alaska. Again, he wrote it for scientists, but everyday people like you and I could read it, and people were blown away. They wanted to know more about what is this place called Alaska. He was an amazing man. A man who loved, he was a naturalist. I wish we could meet him today. I wish there's some way we could, like in Star Trek, make him come back. And talk to him and say, what do you think today? Well, he influenced a lot of people, in particular a man with a lot of money, an industrialist named Edward Harriman. He's one of the most wealthy men in the world and one of the greatest philanthropists. And he effectively put the first cruise to Alaska because everybody wanted to see this place that John Muir was writing about. He was the owner, Harriman was the owner of the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific railroads, so inspired that he put the charter together with one of the finest steamships of the day out of San Francisco and then Seattle, right there in 1898, and he invited some of the great minds of the day to go along with him. This was one of the greatest public relations events ever for Alaska. I hear the beginning. I feel the wheels moving. Here we go. He took people up there, including folks like Edward Curtis, who did fantastic photography. The paintings of Louis Fuertes. The words of a man named John Burroughs, including the science of W.H. Dahl. Alaska was brought to the spotlight the world over. This Harriman Alaska series was written by the scribe of the expedition, of course, John Burroughs, who was at the time one of the best-selling nature writers. Muir had a heavy hand in the writing, and other scientists were hired to write about the different animals. And altogether, there were 14 volumes, and it took 17 years to write all these volumes. And guess what? They are still being referred to today. We may or may not know it, but there is so much research still going on about Alaska and, of course, the changes. So, while naturalists and scientists were exploring for the first time, the Klondike Gold Rush happens. And this would introduce 100,000 would-be prospectors to what we call the last frontier. They call themselves, or they were called, stampeders. They came out of Seattle. They came from all over, but they went through Seattle and up the Pacific coast, just like we did. They were headed for Skagway. At the time, Skagway was where they thought the gold would be, and of course there was some. But without getting into the details of the gold rush, gold was found all in the areas that we have been talking about. Even down here, a little bit was found. By the end of the 50s, when they closed the mines in Juneau, $60 million worth of gold had been found in Juneau. So there was gold, but it began in Skagway. The photographs of a man named Eric Hegg document the stampeders' journey. And it brought home the realities to everyone who could see it, of the hardships that are endured by men and women. Lots of women went, and I don't mean to go work on Creek Street. I'm talking about women who were widows, women who supported their husbands and they were out there digging and gold panning just like the rest of them. And there's a wonderful book called The Women of the Klondike, too, that you can read about. And there was another man that was a stampeder, and his name was Jack London. When I was 8 years old, I want to share this with you because it's important to me. I hope you don't mind. I went to the public library with my daddy. He goes over and he pulls out this book. He says, "Linda, you need to read this." "Okay, Daddy." All of a sudden, I'm reading Call of the Wild. And if you read it today, if you go back and read it, it still has the same feelings. I was crying about the dog, and then all of a sudden, here's this place called Alaska. What is this place? And Daddy said, go look it up in the encyclopedia. There was no internet to go to Google and look it up, or Wikipedia. Go look it up in the encyclopedia. And suddenly, I wanted to know, where is Alaska? What is this? Every single person somewhere in their lifetime goes, I need to know more about that place called Alaska. That's wild. Jack London, Call of the Wild, and White Fang. And then there was a man who was also a stampeder, who became one of America's greatest poets, Robert Service. One of the books that he wrote about being here and the hard life as a stampeder is called Songs of a Sourdough. I have something just a real short thing I want to read to you that he wrote. And he was on a beach, on one of our many beaches in Alaska, and he picked up a grain of sand, and he said, this is the last verse, "For look, within my hollow hand, while round the earth careens, I hold a single grain of sand and wonder what it means. Ah, if I had the eyes to see and a brain to understand, I think life's mysteries might be solved in this little grain of sand." If you don't know, I know you know this one. Maybe you studied in high school. I know I did. The first and last verse goes like this. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was the night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee. So, Robert Service, that was his contribution of many, many beautiful poems he wrote about the hardships and living and being a stampeder. And, of course, he went on to be one of America's greatest poets. What's that? Yes, he certainly was. The Klondike was kind of a mixed area. This is what's interesting for those of you. He asked about the Klondike. What happened was, The gold itself was found in an area that we now, Yukon means Canada now. But what happened was, because the Canadians were on that mountain, they knew there were no borders yet. But the Canadians kind of said, okay, we're here. We're going to stop you from getting over this mountain that you saw, unless you have 1 year worth of supplies, which is the equivalent of 2,000 pounds or 1 ton. That's like 50 pounds of bacon. So that thing you saw them walking up and down, they had to do that 30 or 40 times just to bring they would let them in. Then they went on to the other side, which we now know as Canada. But this is the interesting story. When they got ready to do the borders for Canada and Alaska, whoever the powers are said, hey, they wanted to make it come further down. They said, you stood on the top of that mountain, and you stopped them there. You didn't come down here and stop them. So the border's then and there, and that's where the border to Canada is. Otherwise, we'd be visiting Juneau, Canada, and Ketchikan, Canada, and Sitka, Canada. But that's where the Canadian Royal Mounties, and I love the Mounties, that's where they stood at the top to stop them. Interesting. A lot of sourdough folks. Not many people made it. Not many people made a lot of money, but some people had lives afterwards, like a man named Nordstrom from Seattle. He didn't make a dime. But he came back and opened a shoe store, and you ladies know the rest is history. It's still going. Nordstrom's is all over the place. I want you to know about this woman. Her name is Marty Murray. She was the first advocate for conservation in Alaska. Her chapter is amazing, and you may never have heard of her. A lot of people in Alaska do. A lot of people that are environmentalists or naturalists know who she is. She was known as Marty, and she came at a very critical time in the history of Alaska. And she ensured that we were able to experience all that we've experienced on this cruise through the wildernesses, through the national parks, etc. She was born in Seattle, but when she was a young girl, her father, who had worked for the government, moved to Anchorage. And so she basically grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. And she was actually the first woman to graduate from the University of Alaska. She was a trailblazer, truly. She was an amazing woman. She was unique. She was as equally comfortable talking to Congress as she was doing a caribou or reindeer study. She married a man named Olas Murray, who was a famous scientist who worked in the Northland with animals and more. He's written many books, and he was a great artist, and he drew lots of pictures, and you can still buy these books. But together, what a team they were, and they loved each other. And their honeymoon, they went on a caribou study for 3 months in the tundra to count the reindeer. That might sound funny to any of us, but that's how their life was. They did it all together. They had children, and they went out in the wilderness with a baby on their back. If there were the mosquitoes, everybody had the nets around them. They did it together, and there was such great love between them. They both loved the wilderness. They loved the land. They didn't know what to do to stop people from ruining the land. They, with others, created what's called the Wilderness Society. But in 1956, the Murrays began a campaign to create what we now know as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, way, way up from us. But it was the beginning. And she went to Congress, and in her speech, she said, "I am testifying as an emotional woman, and I would like to ask you gentlemen, what's wrong with emotion? Beauty is a resource in and of itself. Alaska must be allowed to be Alaska. That is her greatest economy. I hope the United States of America is not so rich that she can afford to let these wildernesses pass by, or so poor they cannot afford to keep them." Well, needless to say, every president from Eisenhower through the decades sought her help and advice, both her and her husband, until her husband passed. And because of what she did, at that point, 8 million acres were set aside. as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And today, it is 19 million acres of the National Wildlife Refuge. In the early 90s, she was recognized by President Clinton for the work that she'd done. Behind the scenes, that's why you probably never heard of her. She didn't need recognition. She wanted to get the work done, to save the land and the animals that go with it, to save the environment of Alaska. She was honored with the highest medal that can be given to an American civilian, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And Clinton said this: she became the prime mover in the creation of one of America's great national treasures and blazed trails for generations to come. Marty Murray. She died on October 19th, 2003 at the age of 101. But her legend in Alaska lives on, and her children and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren still continue her work. Her work, along with folks that are of today and her period of time, the conservations and folks just like you and me, have helped to ensure that 56% of Alaska's unique wilderness is protected and preserved for future generations. Look at that, and you will see where we are in the Tongass National Park. We also have a man to thank, President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1911, he passed the act that began the national park system. Because at that point, what they call the robber barons, and they did good work. They built the railroads. They built the industries. They were in Pittsburgh building steel, creating steel. I mean, this was part of the growth of the good growth of the United States. But at the same time, something had to go. And a lot of people wanted to make sure that it wasn't the land. So Roosevelt found a happy medium between all of that. Yes, we'll have progress. Yes, we'll have railroads. Yes, we will build high skyscrapers, but we will keep the lands that we love as national parks. You may or may not recognize that young man. This is a phenomenon that I want to share with you very quickly. His name is Christopher McCandless. He did cause a lot of problems for the Alaska Park Rangers, not himself personally, but with this thing called this McCandless phenomenon. And let me share this with you because you're going to understand what I want to get through. It's where young men and women come to Alaska to challenge themselves against an unforgiving wilderness where the possibility of rescue is remote at best. Some people say it is suicide to try and do those things. Just go off in the wilderness, not prepared, got a little bit of food. This has been a problem for park rangers before and after this young man, but his story was an interesting one. And an author named John Krakauer wrote a book called Into the Wild that was made into a movie in 2007. Krakauer, the author, is quick to point out that, I'm going to quote this, that what seems like an arrogance is really an actual overwhelming desire to be the first to explore a blank spot on the map. As he points out, Krakauer says, guess what? There are no more blank spots on the map. There never will be. We've got all the blank spots. We know where they are. But we as humans have this innate human instinct to go, not to go to places that not everybody's been, to discover new things, even if it's just new for you. Whether it is the first people, Vitus Bering, Vancouver, John Muir, or you. We are all Alaska explorers. A land that is the last frontier, you may or may not have noticed. Let me see if that's on here. There's our Alaska. You may or may not noticed the license plate says last frontier too. McKinley, Mount McKinley. All of us, whether we're on a cruise ship, you're not a guest or a passenger. You're all together in this. You share all of this. It's not like a normal cruise to the Caribbean. This has been a week, I hope, of discovery. And even those of you that return, you've been before, you're discovering new things, right? You are. The trip to Alaska is unlike anything else because what happens is it's so full of open spaces, open, full spaces, that it's hard to imagine humanity being a part of it. I hope that somewhere on one of your tours, when you watched the whales and it took your breath away, or the otters, or maybe somewhere in the Glacier Bay area where you found a place of serenity and peace. That's what it's all about. Because somewhere in all this majesty that I refer to sometimes as the cathedral of Mother Nature, what happens is that we feel suddenly very small. Not because of everything being so big, but that this isn't my world. This is who I am. It's not my ego. It's not the bills at home. It's not all the problems with the people, blah, 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 blah. This is the real me. I remember that person. That's the person that first saw an owl in a tree. Or I saw lightning bugs. Or the first time I saw a frog jump into a pond. Or the first time I was able to climb up a hill or play in a creek. That was so much fun. You discovered it. And when you get that feeling, it takes you back. And it reminds you that little part of you has never gone away. And that is the real you. No matter what life has brought you to this point, this little part of you will never go away. That human instinct to discover something beautiful, something bigger than who we are, something that's much more important than all our little trivial worldly problems. So while we're all on this exploration together, in the end, it's how you feel. I mean, we can hold hands and watch the sunset, and none of us will feel the same identical things as we watch it. But what matters is how you feel. Whether it's James Cook or the Murrays or Vancouvers of the world, this is an Alaska that is going to be preserved for anyone. So for those of you, I'm always so happy when I see grandparents bringing their grandchildren. Because statistics have told us now, because of our technical age, if we do not expose children to nature, by the age of 15, they will never get it. They won't care if a humpback whale's in the ocean. It's not the same world that we grew up in. So, when I see that, I go, you know what, even if your grandchildren or your children aren't here, sometime while the weather's nice, maybe where you live the leaves are changing color, take a day or two, whatever, and just take your kids, even if they're screaming, take them to a state park. Find a park. Have a picnic. Walk a little bit. Talk about the trees. What do you think that is? You know, do you see a bird? Let's be quiet. Let's listen for the birds. Maybe there's some birds. This is what happens in the fall. The leaves change. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Every one of you lives somewhere, and if you have those children in your life, take them and share that with them. Those moments of silence where nature is much more important than who we are, and we connect with it. Yes, we are all Alaska explorers. We're not guests and passengers. We're explorers. And even bigger than that, we are pilgrims of the world as we travel. You're going to take this with you, go back home, and you're going to know. Tell your stories. I'm going to share with you some photographs to maybe spark a memory that you will take back.
each other.